The fog of the Seine clung to the embankments like a shroud, muffling the footsteps of early risers and swallowing the glow of the street lamps. Inside the heavy silence of the Quai des Orfèvres, Maigret stood before a case that seemed at once impossible and inevitable. A prisoner, locked securely in his cell, watched day and night, somehow managed to commit an act outside the walls that no sane man could believe. The mystery was not whether the man was guilty, but how he could have acted at all. And in that impossibility, Maigret sensed the presence of deception, of hidden corridors in human nature, more labyrinthine than any prison passage. It was the sort of puzzle that drew him not for its trick, but for the shadow it cast across ordinary lives. Before we descend further into this fog-bound mystery, take a moment to ensure you do not miss the path it winds through. Subscribe to this channel, share this story with those who savor the peculiar atmosphere of Simenon's Paris, and let the lantern of Maigret's pipe smoke guide you through each turn of the investigation. One of the morning began, as so many others had, at the Quai des Orfèvres, with the fog from the Seine, drifting lazily through the streets of Paris, blurring the outlines of lamps and buildings until they seemed to be suspended in a dream. Maigret arrived with his overcoat collar turned up, his bowler pulled low against the damp, his broad figure pressing steadily through the mist as if the city had grown thicker overnight. Inside the police headquarters, the atmosphere was warmer, filled with the mingled scents of damp wool, coffee in tin cups, and the heavy smoke of pipes already lit by men who had been waiting since dawn. But there was something else in the air that morning, a tension, a whisper of incredulity that flitted from desk to desk. When Maigret pushed open the door of his office, Janvier was there, nervous, restless, shifting from foot to foot. "Patron," he said in a voice that betrayed both excitement and doubt, "they're saying it's impossible, yet they swear it happened." Maigret removed his coat with deliberate slowness, hung it on the peg, and filled his pipe before speaking. He struck a match and let the flame glow in his eyes as he drew the smoke in, savouring it before exhaling into the thick air. Only then did he ask, "What's impossible, Janvier?" The inspector leaned closer, lowering his voice, though no one else was near. "The man in cell 12, patron, he never left it. The guards swear on their honour. The door was locked, bolted, the key in the chief warder's pocket. And yet, last night, in the Rue du Four, a man was attacked. The victim swears his assailant was none other than our prisoner." For a long moment, Maigret said nothing. The notion hovered in the smoke between them like an absurd jest. He had seen many strange cases in his time, men who vanished into thin air, crimes that seemed to contradict reason. But always there had been some thread, some overlooked detail that once pulled, unravelled the entire illusion. He tamped the bowl of his pipe with his thumb and finally muttered, "We'll see." By the time he crossed the courtyard and entered the section of the prison where cell 12 was housed, the rumour had taken on a life of its own. Warders exchanged glances, prisoners whispered in their dark corners, clerks scribbled notes for reports that would travel upward through the bureaucratic chain. Maigret walked slowly, his heavy steps echoing against the stone, his keen eyes observing the details others dismissed, the scuff of boots along the corridor floor, the dampness seeping into mortar lines, the way a warder's gaze flickered nervously toward the locked door. At last he stood before cell 12. The iron door was massive, scratched and pitted with years of service. Its keyhole gleamed dully from constant use, and the bolts, thick as a man's wrist, were drawn across from the outside. The chief warder, a stout fellow with a walrus moustache, jangled a ring of keys in his hand. His voice shook slightly as he explained, "Inspector, since 8 o'clock last night this cell has not been opened. I locked it myself. The prisoner was inside. My men confirm it. And yet—" He spread his hands helplessly. "Open it," Maigret ordered. The bolts shrieked against their guides. The key turned with a heavy click, and the door swung inward. A narrow chamber was revealed, a cot with a threadbare blanket, a wooden stool, a chipped enamel basin, a barred window that admitted little more than a smear of grey light. And on the cot, propped against the wall, sat the prisoner. His name was Paul Darshand, 36 years old, once a clerk in a provincial bank, convicted of fraud and awaiting further judgment on suspected accomplices. He looked up with weary eyes, unshaven, his expression curiously calm. "You've heard, Inspector," he said softly, as if amused by the fuss around him. Maigret entered the cell, his bulk filling the narrow space, the smoke of his pipe curling into the cold air. He said nothing at first, merely examined the prisoner, the bed, the basin, the window with its rusted bars. There was no sign of tampering, no trace of forced exit. The door itself was too solid for trickery. Yet the story from the Rue du Four clung stubbornly to the imagination. A victim assaulted, witnesses glimpsing a figure, and all describing Darshand as though they had rehearsed it. "You deny leaving this cell?" Maigret asked finally, his voice low, steady. Darshand spread his hands with a faint smile. "How could I leave, Monsieur l'Inspecteur? You see the door, the window. You have your warders who swear they kept watch. If they say I left, then they lie. If they say I stayed, then the others lie. Which will you believe?" It was said without defiance, almost with resignation, as if the riddle amused him more than it threatened. Maigret studied him a long while, the silence broken only by the drip of water somewhere in the corridor and the faint hum of the city beyond the walls. He had dealt with clever men before, men who delighted in weaving illusions. Yet there was something weary in Darchand's eyes, something that spoke not of cunning, but of a man who had ceased to struggle against fate. Back in the corridor, Maigret questioned the warders. Each swore with solemnity. Darshand had not left. The chief warder even described checking through the little viewing slit at irregular intervals through the night. Each time the prisoner had been there, lying on his cot or sitting at the stool. No sound of escape, no ruse. And yet across Paris, in a narrow street lit by gas lamps and echoing with the hooves of late-night carriages, a man named Morel had been attacked, beaten, robbed, left bruised and shaken. His account was detailed, his insistence unyielding. He knew Darshand from before, from the days when the clerk had handled money with quick fingers, and he was certain it was the same man who had struck him. Other witnesses corroborated his description. As the reports were laid on Maigret's desk later that morning, the inspector sat in silence, puffing his pipe, his massive frame leaning back in the worn armchair. Outside, the mist of the Seine clung stubbornly to the city, as if Paris itself was reluctant to reveal the truth. He considered the possibilities. Had the victim lied, motivated by old grudges? Had the witnesses been influenced, their memories coloured by gossip? Or had the impossible occurred, a prisoner acting outside his locked cell, a ghost of flesh and bone haunting both stone walls and the city streets? The day wore on. Clerks hurried with papers, telephones rang with clipped voices, warders were called again and again to repeat their accounts. Through it all, Maigret remained calm, his heavy lids half closed, his mind turning slowly but relentlessly, grinding detail against detail like stones that would eventually spark. He knew that impossibilities were illusions, yet illusions could destroy men as surely as knives. When evening fell, Maigret walked once more through the corridors of the prison. The gas lamps sputtered, shadows stretched long, and the damp chill seemed to seep into his bones. He paused outside cell 12, listening to the prisoner's slow breathing within. Then he turned away, his thoughts heavy, knowing that the mystery was not merely a locked door, but the strange web of human lives, each strand vibrating with hidden truths. The night closed in over Paris, and the Seine carried its mist past the darkened facades, past bridges where lovers whispered and vagrants huddled. Somewhere in that mist lay the thread that would unravel the enigma of Paul Darchant. Maigret felt it, as certain as the weight of his pipe in his hand, though he could not yet see its shape. He only knew that the case had already begun to grow beyond the walls of the prison, as if the city itself were complicit in the deception. And so the story of the prisoner who never left his locked cell began, not with proof, nor with logic, but with the quiet persistence of doubt, the kind that seeps into a man's thoughts and refuses to be silenced. The corridors of the prison were like veins of stone, damp and endless, where footsteps echoed long after the man who made them had passed. For years they had carried the murmurs of despair, the clank of keys, the monotonous shouts of warders. Yet that morning, their soundscape was different. It was charged with something more insidious than routine. Whispers that skittered across the walls like rats, rumours gnawing at the certainties of iron and law. Maigret walked slowly through them, his heavy overcoat brushing the rough stone, his pipe's smoke trailing behind him like a moving fog within the gloom. He had no need to force silence. His very presence drew it out of men. Warders straightened at their posts, clerks avoided his gaze, prisoners fell silent at the sound of his approach. But silence was deceptive. Behind it, the whispers remained, clinging to the air like damp. A guard, young, his cheeks still soft, shuffled nervously when Maigret paused before him. "What are they saying?" the inspector asked, his tone neither harsh nor gentle, but weighted with inevitability. The young man hesitated, eyes darting to the ground. "They say there must be a passage, patron, an old tunnel, from the days before when this was something else. The walls look solid, but maybe—" His words faltered beneath Maigret's stare. The inspector puffed at his pipe, considering. Every prison in France had its legends of forgotten tunnels, of hidden doors bricked over and left to memory. Most were nonsense, the inventions of idle tongues. Yet he knew how such stories grew, how they filled the void of the inexplicable. The impossible always bred legends. Further along, in a dim corridor where the gas lamps sputtered and the plaster peeled like tired skin, Maigret stopped before a cluster of warders. They spoke in lowered voices until they felt the weight of his gaze. One of them, older, his face furrowed like weathered stone, finally cleared his throat. "Inspector, with respect, we have all seen strange things. Some men, they bribe, they trick. There are others who walk in two skins, one in the cell, one outside. The prisoners say this Darchant has a brother, a twin perhaps." Maigret said nothing, but the idea lodged itself in the stream of murmurs. A twin, a double. It was the sort of explanation that satisfied the imagination, yet explained nothing. He let the warders speak, absorbing every detail of their fear, for fear was a currency in prisons. Later, in the narrow passage outside the registry office, he overheard two clerks bent over their ledgers. One whispered of the guards being drunk, of money changing hands, of the possibility that the prisoner had slipped out, while eyes were clouded. The other shook his head, insisting that no such negligence could have occurred. Yet their hushed tones betrayed more than professional caution. They betrayed curiosity, sharpened by dread. Maigret moved on, never hurrying, his bulk steady, his pipe glowing faintly in the dim light. He was not interested in silencing gossip. He wanted to hear it, to trace its threads, for in every rumor lay a fragment of truth, or at least the shape of the fear that truth would cast. In the prisoners' wing, where men pressed against the bars to catch a glimpse of the inspector, the whispers were bolder. They called out through grins, through sly eyes, through voices thick with mockery. "Eh, patron, ask him how he walks through walls," one jeered. Another shouted, "It was his ghost, Maigret. Better arrest the ghost before it strikes again." But beneath the laughter, Maigret caught a different note. Envy, admiration, the sort of awe prisoners held for anyone who appeared to have beaten the system, even in rumor. They longed for legends of impossible escape, for the idea that walls and locks were not final. Darshand, sitting quietly in his cell, had already become something more than himself. By noon, the prison had taken on the feel of a theatre in which every man, whether guard or captive, played his part in the unfolding drama. The impossible had made them actors, their lines drawn from fear and fascination. Even the chaplain, a pale man with watery eyes, muttered to Maigret in passing that there were forces beyond iron and stone, that some men carried shadows that reached further than their bodies. Maigret dismissed none of it outright. He carried each rumor in his mind like a pebble in his pocket, turning it over, weighing it. He knew most would crumble into dust under scrutiny. Yet sometimes, in the shape of a lie, one found the outline of the truth. He returned to his office at the Quai des Orfèvres in the late afternoon, the fog outside unbroken, the river invisible though its smell drifted through the city. On his desk lay a pile of reports, statements from the victim, from witnesses in the Rue du Four, from warders who repeated their tales until they blurred. Janvier waited anxiously by the stove, feeding it coal, watching Maigret with the eyes of a pupil seeking answers from a master. "They'll have us chasing ghosts, patron," Janvier muttered. "The men believe anything. I even heard someone say he has the devil's help." Maigret lowered himself heavily into the armchair, stretching his legs, and said nothing. He struck a match and relit his pipe. The flare illuminated his face, calm, unreadable. He drew in the smoke, exhaled slowly. The whispers of the prison seemed to follow him here, settling in the corners of the office like invisible companions. Janvier shuffled, then asked, "Do you believe it's possible, patron? That he left the cell?" Maigret did not answer at once. His eyes lingered on the window, where condensation streaked the glass. Outside, the fog pressed against the pane like a living thing. Finally, he said, "I believe men are more complicated than doors and keys, that's all." It was neither denial nor acceptance. Janvier sighed, rubbed his temples, and returned to the reports. As dusk fell, the whispers grew louder beyond the prison walls. The newspapers caught wind of the story. Headlines hinted at scandal, at the failure of justice. The public loved impossibilities, and already the cafes buzzed with theories. Some swore the police conspired to free the prisoner. Others claimed Darchand had indeed a double, roaming Paris, while his twin languished in confinement. A few went further, suggesting corruption that reached into the highest offices. For Maigret, these murmurs were no different from those in the corridors. They were the echo of disbelief made public, the city's way of grappling with the unreasonable. Yet he knew that every rumor, every whisper carried its own kind of evidence, not about what had happened, but about what people feared had happened. And fear could shape truth as surely as fact. That night, long after the lamps were lit and the fog thickened into drizzle, Maigret returned once more to the prison. He walked the same corridors, heard the same whispers, but now they seemed heavier, as if the walls themselves carried them. He paused before cell 12 again, watching through the slit. Darshan sat as before, motionless, his face pale in the faint light. And in the silence, broken only by the drip of water and the distant clang of a bell, Maigret felt the case tightening around him. The impossibility was no longer confined to a single act on a foggy street. It had spread like mould through stone, feeding on the minds of warders, clerks, prisoners, and the public beyond. The mystery had ceased to be a matter of one man's guilt. It had become a question of belief itself, how much weight men gave to rumour when reason faltered. As he turned away, his pipe glowing faintly in the dark corridor, Maigret thought of the victim, of the witnesses, of Darshan himself. And above all, he thought of the whispers, weaving their net around truth like cobwebs in a forgotten hall. Somewhere within them lay the path forward, though it was as hidden as the Seine beneath the fog. The next morning, the fog still clung to Paris, pressing itself against the windows of the Quai des Orfèvres, as though the river had crept inland and seeped into every crevice of the city. Maigret arrived earlier than usual, his broad shoulders hunched against the damp, his bowler glistening with droplets. The lamps in the corridor had not yet been extinguished, and their yellow halos made the mist glow with a sickly pallor. Inside, the warmth of the stove and the familiar chatter of clerks offered no comfort. The case hung over the building like a storm that would not pass. Janvier greeted him with a file under his arm, his face pale from lack of sleep. "They've repeated their statements again, patron," he said, thrusting the papers forward. "The warders don't budge. The victim insists. Darshan hasn't changed a word either." Maigret nodded, but did not take the file. Instead, he shrugged off his coat, hung it on the peg, and filled his pipe with slow, deliberate movements. He tamped the tobacco with his thumb, struck a match, and leaned back as the first curl of smoke rose. Only then did he murmur, "I'll go to him. Alone." The prison loomed with its habitual indifference, the iron gates clanging shut behind him, the stone corridors absorbing every sound like a sponge. Maigret walked steadily, his presence so heavy that men flattened themselves against the walls as he passed. The guards avoided his gaze, the prisoners stared with wide eyes, their whispers hushed into silence. He descended deeper into the heart of the building, where the air smelled of disinfectant, sweat, and the faint sweetness of old tobacco that clung to men's clothes. Cell 12 awaited him, its iron door bolted as firmly as ever. The chief warder stood stiffly beside it, his moustache bristling with anxiety. "He's as he was, Inspector. Quiet. He asked for nothing this morning." Maigret motioned for the bolts to be drawn. The scream of metal against metal echoed down the corridor like the groan of some vast beast. The key turned, the lock yielded, and the door swung inward. The cell was small, its walls damp, the plaster mottled with stains. A narrow iron cot with a thin mattress stood against the wall. A wooden stool, a basin with a crack running down its side, a slop bucket half hidden in the corner. Above, a barred window let in a sliver of pale light, no larger than a handspan. The air was heavy with the mingled scents of cold stone and unwashed linen. Paul Darshan sat on the cot, his back against the wall, his head tilted slightly as if he had been waiting. He wore the coarse prison uniform, its fabric sagging on his thin frame. His eyes lifted to Maigret's with a calm that was almost insolent. "Inspector," he said, his voice flat, almost polite. Maigret closed the door behind him, leaving the warder outside, and took a step into the room. His pipe smoke drifted upward, curling against the ceiling, before dissolving into the damp. He said nothing at first, only let his gaze move slowly across the cell, from the cot to the window to the floor, where faint marks suggested restless pacing. He bent slightly, examining the bars, running a thick finger along their cold surface. They were rusted but unbroken, immovable. He crouched to study the lock from inside. Its iron teeth gleamed with fresh scratches from years of turning, but none recent. Finally, he settled on the stool, his knees spreading wide, pipe clamped between his teeth, and looked directly at the prisoner. "You've heard the story, of course," he said. Darshant gave a faint smile. "I've heard many stories these last hours, some amusing, some less so. They say you struck a man in the Rue du Four, beat him, robbed him. They say others saw you. They swear it." "And yet," Darshant replied evenly, "you find me here, in this charming room, with its exquisite view of grey skies." He gestured toward the window with a casual flick of his hand. "You tell me, Inspector, how I could have been both here and there." His tone was calm, almost philosophical, but Maigret noted the twitch at the corner of his mouth, the slight tremor in his fingers. He watched Darshant as a hunter watches an animal, not for what it shows, but for what it conceals. "You knew Morel, the victim," Maigret said. "You worked together once. That is true. He accuses you with certainty." "Certainty," Darshant repeated, as if savouring the word. "Men are certain of many things, Inspector. They are certain the sun will rise tomorrow, yet one day it will not. They are certain their wives are faithful, their children honest, their friends loyal. Certainty is the most dangerous of illusions." Maigret puffed his pipe, saying nothing. The silence grew thick, heavy as the damp walls. Finally he leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "You want me to believe it was impossible. You want me to believe you could not leave this cell." "I want nothing," Darshant replied softly. "I sit here. Others talk. That is all." Maigret let the silence linger. He stood, walked slowly around the cell, examining every surface. He tapped the walls with his knuckles, listening to the sound, solid, unyielding. He crouched to peer beneath the cot, lifted the mattress, sniffed the stale fabric. He studied the floor, the faint scratches from boots, the dark stains that might have been old spills. Every inch spoke of confinement, of monotony, of a man hemmed in by stone. Yet something unsettled him, though he could not yet name it. It was not the objects themselves, but the way Darshant sat watching him, as though the prisoner too were conducting an inspection, as though Maigret were the one on trial. "You've been quiet these past days," Maigret said finally. "The warders say you make no trouble. You keep to yourself." "What use is trouble when the walls are thicker than your will?" "And yet outside you make trouble enough." Darchant's eyes flickered, then steadied. "If I had," he said slowly, "would I be fool enough to return here and sit waiting for you?" The question hung in the damp air, as insoluble as the riddle itself. Maigret rose from the stool, his heavy figure filling the cell. He knocked the ash from his pipe into his palm, emptied it carefully, and pocketed it. Then he looked down at Darchant, his voice low. "You are right about one thing. Stories are dangerous. They spread faster than truth, and they bind men more tightly than chains." Without waiting for a reply, he turned and rapped on the door. The bolts screeched, the lock clicked, and the warder swung it open. Maigret stepped into the corridor, his coat brushing the frame, the damp air greeting him like a second skin. He did not look back at Darchant, though he felt the prisoner's eyes following him. As he walked the corridor once more, the whispers seemed louder than ever, but now they carried a new note. The guards, the clerks, even the prisoners sensed that Maigret had gone in and returned unsettled. They saw it in his set jaw, in the heaviness of his step. They knew the inspector had looked into the cell and found no answers, and that absence was more troubling than any revelation. By the time he returned to the Quai des Orfèvres, evening had fallen. The fog thickened into drizzle, and the lamps along the embankment glowed like blurred halos. In his office, Maigret sat heavily, filled his pipe again, and stared at the reports. He thought of Darchan's calm eyes, of the walls that gave up no secrets, of the faint scratches on the floor, the silence that pressed itself into every corner. He thought of the victim's certainty, the witness's insistence, the warder's oaths. And still the impossibility remained. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and let the smoke curl upward. Somewhere in the details lay the thread, invisible but waiting to be pulled. Until then, the locked cell remained what it had been from the first moment, a stone riddle mocking the very notion of reason. It was raining in Paris when the telegram arrived, a soft, steady drizzle that blurred the outlines of the bridges and made the lamps along the quay appear to melt into pools of gold. Maigret was at his desk, a half-smoked pipe resting between his fingers, when Janvier entered with the folded slip of paper. His face carried the excitement of news, though tempered by hesitation, as though uncertain whether the words it bore would bring clarity or further confusion. "A message from Angers, patron," he said, laying the telegram on the blotter. Maigret unfolded it slowly, his heavy fingers deliberate, as if every motion carried the weight of inevitability. The clipped language of the provincial police spoke plainly. A robbery had occurred the night before in Angers, some 200 kilometers from Paris. The description of the assailant matched that of Paul Darchand, cell 12, beyond dispute. The victim, a merchant, claimed he had known Darchand years ago and had no doubt. Witnesses agreed the man had spoken little during the assault, but his features, his manner were unmistakable. For a long moment Maigret stared at the telegram without moving. The drizzle tapped softly at the window. Janvier shifted nervously by the stove, waiting for his reaction. At last, Maigret exhaled a plume of smoke and muttered, "So now he was in Angers as well." He did not raise his voice, but the words carried a gravity that seemed to deepen the silence in the room. That afternoon, Maigret made arrangements. By evening, he was on the train bound south, his pipe clenched between his teeth as the countryside rolled past in the fading light. The compartment was warm, smelling of damp wool and coal smoke, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels lulling passengers into a weary drowse. Maigret sat heavily, his thoughts steady but circling, the way smoke circled in the lamplit compartment. He watched fields dissolve into darkness, villages slip by with their lamps flickering in the mist. The journey was long, stretching deep into the night. At the corridor's end, a door opened now and again, letting in a rush of cold air and the smell of rain-soaked timber. Travellers murmured to one another in low tones, their reflections swaying in the window glass. Maigret remained silent, his bulk immobile, as if rooted in the rhythm of the train. Yet within his mind travelled further than the rails, tracing the impossible geometry of a prisoner present in two places at once. He arrived in Angers at dawn. The provincial station was grey with drizzle, porters moving sluggishly, their boots clattering on wet cobbles. Maigret pulled up his collar and stepped into the town, its narrow streets glistening, shutters half open, as early risers hurried toward cafes for warmth. The gendarmerie stood on a quiet square, its tricolour flag limp in the damp air. Inside, the local commissaire greeted him with a mix of respect and embarrassment. "Inspector Maigret, we did not expect Paris to involve itself so quickly, but the case is peculiar." "I've heard," Maigret replied, removing his overcoat, the water dripping onto the tiled floor. His pipe was unlit, resting between his teeth as if waiting. The commissaire led him to a cluttered office where reports lay in untidy piles. The victim, Monsieur Brenot, insists he was attacked by Paul d'Archamps. He says he knew him from dealings years ago in Tours. Our witnesses confirm the likeness. The merchant's injuries are real enough. A blow to the head, some bruises, money taken from his satchel. It was late, in a dim street near the river. But their certainty, Inspector, it is remarkable. Maigret settled heavily into a chair, his coat steaming gently from the stove's warmth. Remarkable, he repeated, his voice dry. He gestured. Bring him in. Monsieur Brenot entered, a stout man with a bandage across his temple, his eyes flashing indignation. He greeted Maigret with the eagerness of a man certain of his righteousness. It was him, Inspector. I swear it. d'Archamps. I knew him once. Years ago. He worked with money, yes, and not honestly. I saw his face in the lamplight when he struck me. How could I mistake it? You are sure? Maigret asked, leaning forward, pipe between his fingers. Certain, Brenot said, his voice firm. I would testify before any court. It was d'Archamps, without doubt. The witnesses who followed told much the same tale, a man seen in shadow, his profile caught in the glow of a street lamp, his movements brusque, his silence eloquent. Each insisted it was d'Archamps, though their descriptions wavered in small details, the length of his coat, the colour of his hat. Yet all spoke with a conviction that left little room for uncertainty. When they had gone, Maigret sat in silence. The commissaire shifted uneasily, waiting for the great inspector's pronouncement. At last, Maigret said only, Certainty, yes, there is always too much of it when truth is furthest away. Later that day, Maigret walked the streets where the robbery had occurred. The rain had ceased, but the stones were slick, the air heavy with the smell of the river. The narrow lane twisted between shuttered houses, their plaster walls streaked with damp. A gas lamp still burned faintly, though the daylight had grown strong, its glass smeared with soot. He stood there, his hat low over his brow, pipe smoke curling upward, imagining the scene. Brenot's footsteps echoing, the sudden figure emerging from shadow, the blow, the fall, the scrambling hands, the rush away. He could see it clearly, yet what he saw was not proof, but theatre, the reconstruction of others' minds. That evening he returned to the station, boarded the train north. The compartment was emptier now, only a few passengers dozing beneath the sway of the lamp. The countryside rolled past in darkness. Maigret sat immobile, his pipe glowing faintly, his thoughts returning again and again to the prisoner in Paris, sitting behind bolted iron, watched by warders who swore he had not moved. By the time he reached the capital, the drizzle had returned. Paris was cloaked in damp mist, the Seine swollen and dark beneath the bridges. At the Quai des Orfèvres, the files waited on his desk. The whispers in the corridors had grown into louder speculations. Newspapers carried the story now. The man who is two men. Headlines asked how the police could keep a prisoner locked while he roamed the provinces unchecked. Politicians muttered of scandal. The public devoured every impossible detail. Maigret, however, was silent. He closed his office door, lit his pipe, and let the smoke drift into the room. He thought of Angers, of Brenot's certainty, of the witness's conviction, of the rain on the narrow street. He thought of d'Archamps sitting quietly in cell 12, his faint smile as though the world's confusion amused him. The riddle had deepened, its lines stretching across the map of France. The impossible was no longer confined to a single night in Paris. It had spread to the provinces, multiplying itself, as though the prisoner's shadow had grown long enough to touch 2 towns at once. And still, behind the iron bolts, the man waited, silent, patient, as if he knew that the walls around him were less confining than the illusions men spun beyond them. Maigret puffed at his pipe and leaned back in his chair. The drizzle tapped the windows, the city's hum was muffled by fog, and somewhere far off a whistle blew on the river. He felt the weight of the case settle heavier upon him. It was no longer a question of escape or trickery. It was a question of how truth could be divided, doubled, scattered across miles, while a single man sat immobile behind iron bars. The following afternoon, when the drizzle gave way to a sullen grey sky, Maigret left the Quai des Orfèvres and took the provincial train once more, this time to Tours. The telegram from Angers had stirred another thread, an address scribbled in a witness's margin, a name mentioned half in passing. It belonged to a woman who had once known Paul Darchand, not as a clerk, not as a criminal, but as a man. The train swayed southward, its compartments filled with the quiet murmur of travellers. Maigret sat heavily in his seat, his coat collar turned up, his pipe unlit between his fingers. Through the streaked window, the countryside slid by, fields glistening with damp, villages crouched low against the sky. He thought not of landscapes, but of faces, of how people carried each other's shadows in memory, how one man could exist in 10 different guises depending on who recalled him. Perhaps this woman would add another mask to Darchand's shifting countenance. It was evening when the train rolled into Tours. The station lamps glowed pale in the mist, and the square beyond was already filling with the smell of roasting chestnuts, of kerosene lamps burning in shop fronts. Maigret walked steadily through the narrow streets, his hat low, his bulk moving against the flow of townsfolk returning home. He found the café easily, its windows hazed with steam, its sign creaking above the door. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and the chatter of patrons. Glasses clinked, chairs scraped, and the kerosene lamps threw uneven halos across the walls, stained with years of use. She was there, as promised, at a small table near the back. She was no longer young, though not yet old, her face marked by lines that spoke less of years than of disappointments endured. A faded scarf was wrapped around her throat, her hands restless against the coffee cup before her. When Maigret approached, she looked up with eyes at once wary and defiant. "Madame Fournier?" he asked quietly. She nodded, gestured to the chair opposite. "You are Inspector Maigret. I wondered if Paris would send someone like you." Maigret lowered himself onto the chair, his presence filling the small space. He lit his pipe, the flare of the match catching the sheen of her tired eyes. For a while neither spoke. The noise of the café pressed around them, the clatter of billiard balls, the burst of laughter, the low murmur of conversations. Finally she said, "I have not seen Paul in years, not since before his troubles. But when I read of him in the papers, it was as if the past had returned. People ask me questions, whisper. They want me to say I know what he is, who he is." She paused, lifted her cup, but her hand trembled slightly. "I do not." "You knew him?" Maigret said. "Yes, too well, perhaps." A faint smile, bitter. He could charm, Inspector. He spoke softly, always softly, as though his words were secrets meant only for you. But beneath that, there was something hidden, something cold. I never saw him angry, never saw him raise his voice. But I always felt he carried another self inside him, like a shadow that waited. Her words lingered in the smoky air, carrying the weight of memory. Maigret studied her face, the tightness around the mouth, the eyes that refused to look away. He let her speak, knowing silence often drew out more than questions. "They say he has been seen," she continued, "in Paris, in Angers, that he leaves his cell. Do you believe it?" Maigret puffed at his pipe, exhaled slowly. "I believe men are complicated, madame, sometimes more complicated than iron and locks." She gave a dry laugh. "That is not an answer." "It is the only one I have." For a moment they sat in silence, the cafe's noise filling the gap. Then she leaned closer, her voice lowering. "There is something I never told the police. Years ago, when Paul and when we were close, he spoke of a man, a cousin perhaps. I never knew for certain. He said they looked alike, more than brothers. I thought he was joking or boasting or inventing tales to impress me, but sometimes I wonder." Maigrey's eyes narrowed. "You never saw this man?" "Once, perhaps. A face in the crowd. I cannot be certain. But Paul, he seemed almost proud of the idea, as if having another self walking the streets gave him power." The inspector leaned back, pipe between his teeth, the smoke rising slowly. A cousin, a double, a shadow. It was another thread, as fragile as rumour, yet one more layer to the mystery. Madame Fournier looked down at her hands, her voice softening. "I do not defend him, Inspector. He hurt me as he hurt others. But I cannot believe he would be foolish enough to strike again so openly. If he did, then it was not Paul I knew." Maigret studied her in silence, weighing the words, the tone, the tremor in her hands. She was not lying, at least not in the obvious way. She was a woman tangled in her own memories, unable to separate truth from longing, guilt from resentment. Her testimony was not proof, but it added shape to the shadow that was Paul Darchand. When he rose to leave, she looked up quickly. "If you find him guilty, Inspector, I will not protest. But if you find he is innocent, remember that too many already believe him guilty without proof." "Certainty," she said bitterly, "is the easiest thing in the world." Outside, the night had deepened. The streets of Tours were slick with rain, the lamps casting pale circles on the cobbles. Maigret walked slowly back to his lodging, his pipe glowing faintly in the mist. He thought of the woman's words, of the cousin, of the shadow self. He thought of Darchand sitting quietly in cell 12, his faint smile when confronted with the impossible. Back in Paris the following morning, the city was alive with gossip. The newspapers had seized on the idea of a double, printing speculative sketches, weaving tales of a brother, a twin, a phantom. Cafes buzzed with theories, and the name Darchand became a kind of incantation for impossibility. Some swore he had mastered a trick of illusion, others insisted he was a devil's emissary. For Maigret, the café in Tours remained vivid. The smoky air, the trembling hands of a woman torn between truth and memory, the half-spoken tale of a cousin. It was neither proof nor invention, but something between, something that hinted at the strange corridors human lives could create, corridors as narrow and shadowed as the ones in the prison. That night, as rain tapped the windows of the Quai des Orfèvres and the Seine swelled darkly beyond the embankment, Maigret sat alone in his office, the reports piled before him, his pipe smoke drifting upward. He felt the case growing heavier, not with facts but with voices, warders, victims, witnesses, women in cafes, all certain, all contradictory, all pulling the truth in opposite directions. And still at the heart of it, the man in cell 12 sat silently, as though the world's confusion amused him more than any freedom. The night after Tours, Paris wore its drizzle like a second skin. The lamps along the embankment bled their light into the damp air, and the Seine moved with the slow assurance of something that has seen all secrets and keeps most of them. Maigret stood at his office window for a time, pipe cupped in his palm, watching the blurred procession of umbrellas and bowler hats glide past the parapet. There was a particular quiet that came over the Quai des Orfèvres at such hours. The clerks gone, the last typewriter silent, the stove ticking softly as coal settled under its own heat. He did not yet sit. He waited for the night to ripen into the sort of stillness that loosens tongues. It was close to 11 when Janvier tapped and eased the door open with the embarrassed caution of a man bringing a rumor into a room that prefers facts. "Patron," he said, half in, half out, "the watchman from Rue du Four is here. He asked for you by name, says he should have spoken earlier, but he had his reasons." Maigret nodded once. "Bring him." The night watchman entered, with the stately awkwardness of men who live between hours. He was small, thin without being fragile, wrapped in a coat polished by weather and years, a cap held respectfully in both hands. His eyes were the colour of gutter water after rain, tired and attentive at once. He stood just inside the door until Maigret gestured to the chair opposite the desk. When he sat, he did so on the edge, like a man prepared to get up again before he grew too comfortable with the idea of confession. "Your name," Maigret said, not unkindly. "Roussel, Inspector. Jules Roussel. I watch the houses around the Rue du Four through the night. Keep an eye, you understand? Make sure the lamps don't go out, that no one climbs where he shouldn't. You were on duty the night Morel was attacked." Roussel's fingers worried the cap's brim. "Yes, monsieur, I made my rounds. 10:30, 11:15, and so on." He glanced at the stove with the absorbed curiosity of cold men near heat, then back to Maigret. "I didn't come sooner because I wasn't sure what I had seen." "Tell it as you saw it, not as you think I want to hear it." A faint relief touched the watchman's face. He drew a breath that seemed to collect the street's damp into his chest. There was mist that night, heavy near the church, lighter by the baker's, thicker again in the alley, behind Morel's building, where the rain settles and the smell of yeast hangs in the bricks. I had just checked the rear gates when I heard a foot scrape. Not a stumble, no, a careful step that didn't want to be heard. When a man wants to be quiet, he forgets that quiet has its own noise. Maigret's eyes softened, a recognition of the man's craft. "Where?" "By the lamp-post facing the cooper's yard. The glass is soot-smudged. You know the one." I turned my head, slow, the way you do when dogs are watching to see if you're watching. And there he was, no, not a face, a shape first. Then the light took him by the cheek, and I thought, I've seen that man somewhere. But the mist moved, and the light shifted, and he was once more only a coat and a dark hat. And then Morel rounded the corner, muttering to himself the way men do when they count money in their heads. He carried a satchel close into his ribs, and he walked the way of people who think they are alone. When he passed me, I nodded. He didn't see. The other man waited. It was quick. A step from the wall, a hand from the coat, a blow that looked like a clumsy embrace. Morel went down with a sound like a sack of potatoes finding a floor. I shouted, "Not brave, Inspector, only loud." The other man turned his head, just so, and that's when I thought, Darshand. But I could have been wrong. The mist can borrow a face and return it altered. "You pursued him?" Roussel's mouth twitched, shame and honesty together. "A few steps. I'm no runner, not at night, not on wet stones." He moved as if he knew the pattern of every puddle. "Slipped through the gate by the coopers, the one that sticks unless you know how to lift it when you pull. I reached it too late. The alley beyond is narrow. It swallows men in 2 seconds, 3 at most. The gate, locked normally? Bolted at the top and bottom, but neighbours prop it open sometimes to fetch deliveries before dawn. Tonight it yielded. I've told the cooper a dozen times he'll have a burglary on his conscience one day." Maigret let the Silence settled long enough for the sound of the river to press faintly at the windows. "When you say you thought of Darchand, was that because of his face, or because the name had been in the air?" Roussel looked at his cap as if it might supply courage. "Both, Inspector. You know how it is when everyone speaks a name. You begin to see it like a watermark. I've seen his photograph. Newspapers, the warders, talk of him when they drift in for coffee on their way home. This man's cheekbone, the line of his jaw, they invited the thought. I can't swear to it as I would to my mother's portrait, but in the moment I would have wagered my week's wages and not complained if I lost." Janvier, standing half in shadow near the stove, shifted a little. Maigret did not look at him. He watched Roussel. "Why come now?" "Because the story has grown," the watchman said, in a smaller voice. "When a story grows, it eats. It eats men's reputations and it eats their courage. I thought, if I told you the parts I doubt as well as the parts I know, perhaps the story would shrink enough to fit the truth again." A corner of Maigret's mouth moved, almost a smile. "Tell me the parts you know." "I know Morel fell. I know the blow was neat, not angry. I know the thief did not fumble. He took the satchel without searching, as if he knew it would be there. I know he moved like a man who had rehearsed the street, and I know his coat smelled faintly of tobacco, not the cheap shag, Inspector, a better leaf. I smell things. It is my profession. And the parts you doubt? That the face I thought I saw is the face that was there. The mist erases lines and writes new ones over them. And I doubt that any man could be in a locked room and in that alley at the same hour, unless the lock is a joke or time is, and I don't believe in joking locks or elastic hours." He hesitated, then added, "I doubt too that the watch I keep is the watch other men keep. When one passes nights alone, the minutes have their own gait." Maigret leaned back, pipe stem at his teeth, and the room's heat drew a soft sheen to his brow. He liked the man's humility. It had the flavour of accuracy. "You said the blow was neat. Describe the gesture." Roussel demonstrated with a careful economy that made Janvier glance up, a half-turn, an elbow angling the victim's shoulder downward, the free hand striking not the skull, but the hinge where jaw meets neck. Just there, enough to loose a man from his feet without splitting him." "Military?" "Could be. Or a man who learned rough lessons with careful teachers." Maigret's mind pulled a thread through the images. Not rage, not the flailing hurry of amateurs. A man who knew how bodies fall. And the satchel taken as if the hand had been told where to close. He thought of Darchand in his cell, that faint, unreadable smile. A bank clerk could learn careful movements of another sort. Perhaps life taught him more. He took down the time Roussel swore by, the sequence of footsteps, the direction of the flight through the Cooper's gate. He asked about the lamps, their glow, the wind in the alley's throat. He asked which windows were usually awake at that hour. Roussel answered with the precise tenderness of a man in charge of other people's darkness. The widow who cannot sleep since her husband died, the baker's boy who wakes too early out of pride, the seamstress who leaves a lamp long after her stitching's done because she fears the dark more when it is honest about itself. When the watchman had finished, he put his cap back in his hands and seemed to weigh it once more before standing. "I am not of the sort who likes the police, Inspector," he said without hostility. "It's not in my blood, but I thought you should know what I know and what I don't." "That's more than most men bring," Maigret said, rising. "If I need you again, I'll send for you." After Roussel left, Janvier exhaled the breath he had been keeping. "He's better than half the witnesses we ever meet, Patron." "Because he respects the fog," Maigret said. Janvier frowned. "The fog?" Maigret relit his pipe, the flare catching the tired paper on the walls. The fog in men's heads as much as the fog on the river. He knows where one ends and the other begins. Most witnesses do not. They stood a moment without speaking. The stove ticked again. Somewhere a door closed far down the corridor with the polite finality of officers putting themselves to bed. "Shall I chase the Cooper's gate?" Janvier asked. "See who props it open and when?" "Yes." "And find out who among Morel's neighbours can truly see that corner from their window, not who wishes to. Speak to the widow. She will watch the street as if it were a clock no one else knows the time of." Janvier gathered his notebook and moved toward the door, then turned back. "Patron, if the blow was neat, if the thief knew the satchel was there, it feels less like a chance street robbery than something that had a reason before midnight." Maigret nodded, smoke curling from the corner of his mouth. "Reasons always go to bed earlier than crimes." When he was alone again, he sat and let the shapes arrange themselves. The careful hand, the practiced step, the gait that yields when lifted just so, the echo of better tobacco in a poor street. He thought of Madame Fournier's cousin who was not a brother, of Angers and Tours, and the neatness with which certainty had attached itself to Darchan's name like a burr to cloth. He thought, too, of the prison corridor, the bolts that squealed dutifully for him, the warder's moustache bristling like a pledge, and of the man on the cot who watched the inspector move about his room as if the cell were the inspector's and the corridor belonged to him. The case felt different now, not larger, not smaller, but firmer, under the hand, as if the fog had withdrawn an inch from the stones. The thief had not been angry. He had been expected, or he had been the one expecting. Either way, the night's narrative did not split cleanly into violence and fear. It contained appointment. Before leaving, Maigret opened the window a finger's width and let the river's damp speak into the room. He was not a man given to reflection for its own sake. His reflections were work. Yet he felt, as he sometimes did, the border of the affair press against other borders, the way the newspaper boys sang their headlines when scandal paid their rent, the way men in offices calculated how much truth a column could bear before it became unprintable, the way reputation shifted like barges moored to rings that have held too long. He suspected he would soon have to step from the quay of facts into the noisier water of opinion. He closed the window and put on his coat. The corridor beyond was empty, the building asleep, but for the steps of a single constable. On the stairs, the inspector's tread sounded like the steady punctuation of a long sentence finding its clause. Outside, Paris breathed out a little rain. The lamps misted, the river kept its counsel. And in a cell whose walls knew the difference between men and stories better than most, Paul Darchan folded his hands on his knees and looked at the door without expression. Maigret set his hat and turned toward the Rue du Fort, toward the Cooper's gate, toward the widow's window, where night had a different speed. He did not quicken his step. He never did. But there was decision in it now, a pressure that gathered toward the next turn. By the time the week had turned, the case of Paul Darchan no longer belonged solely to the corridors of the prison or to the files stacked at the Quai des Orfèvres. It had spilled into the boulevards, the cafes, the newsstands where men in caps jostled for the latest edition before the ink was even dry. Paris had seized upon the story with the ferocity of a city starved for marvels. Impossible crimes, like theatre, demanded spectators, and now every patron with a glass of wine in hand considered himself an expert on cells, locks, and doubles. Maigret walked slowly through the streets that morning, his heavy overcoat buttoned, his pipe clenched in his teeth. The damp had lifted a little, but the sky remained leaden, and the newspapers cried from every kiosk. "L'homme aux deux visages," declared one. "A phantom in the prison," proclaimed another. Even the more sober journals could not resist the lure of paradox. A man locked and yet free, guilty and yet untouchable. At the office, Janvier brought the morning's press and spread it across the inspector's desk. Headlines sprawled in thick black letters. Some papers accused the police of negligence, others whispered of corruption in the prison service, while a few, always the most reckless, suggested that Maigret himself had been fooled, that the venerable inspector had met his match. "They are circling like vultures, patron," Janvier muttered, anger flickering in his eyes. "Each one hungrier than the last." Maigret puffed calmly at his pipe, the smoke curling upward. "It is their business to feed," he said. "They would starve if men stopped inventing impossibilities." But even as he said it, he felt the press breathing hot against the case, shaping public opinion faster than truth could move. It was no longer enough to solve the riddle. He would have to strip away the layers of gossip that wrapped it. That was always the more difficult part, for rumour clung tighter than fact. By midday he was summoned to the office of a magistrate, a tall room with velvet curtains drawn against the city's noise, its air smelling faintly of ink and dust. The magistrate, pale and narrow as the desk he sat behind, gestured Maigret into a chair. He tapped the stack of newspapers with thin fingers. "You see what they are saying, Inspector. The credibility of the courts, the prisons, even the police is at stake. The public loves sensation, but politicians do not. They are asking questions already, whether the ministry must intervene, whether disciplinary measures are needed." Maigret said nothing, only lit his pipe, the flame briefly illuminating his broad features. He let the silence grow until the magistrate shifted in his seat. At last Maigret said, "The case is not solved by declarations, it is solved by patience. The man in cell 12 is the same man the public claims to see in Angers or on the Rue du Four. Either their eyes lie or the walls do, but one truth is enough. I will find it." The magistrate sighed, glancing at the window as though the fog outside pressed upon him too. "See that you do. For the moment the city runs on headlines, not verdicts. And when headlines run too far ahead of verdicts, governments stumble." That afternoon Maigret walked the embankment of the Seine. The air smelled of wet stone, of barges pushing slowly through the current, their smoke trailing like sentences unfinished. He felt the case shifting, no longer the private puzzle of a prisoner in a locked room, but a stage where the press, politicians and rumour played as many roles as the suspects. It was as if Darchant himself, without leaving his cot, had managed to throw the entire city into performance. In a café near the Pont Neuf, he sat with his pipe, observing. Men in heavy coats leaned over newspapers, jabbing fingers at sketches of Darchant's face. Some argued for a twin, others for bribed guards, still others for supernatural explanations uttered with the relish of the absurd. Women whispered of curses, of devils, of strange bargains struck behind stone walls. The air buzzed with certainty, though every certainty contradicted another. Maigret listened without listening, letting the voices wash over him. It was not the details that mattered, but the hunger behind them, the way people craved the impossible as much as bread. It reminded him of other cases when the city had turned rumour into spectacle. Always, beneath the laughter and outrage, there was fear. The fear that if the world could no longer be explained, then no door was safe, no wall firm, no law secure. When he returned to the Quai des Orfèvres that evening, Lucas was waiting, a note of urgency in his voice. "Patron, there was a question in the chamber today. A deputy, asked whether the police are complicit in hiding d'Archam's movements. The minister gave assurances, but he shrugged. "The tide is rising." Maigret merely nodded, filled his pipe again, and sat in his armchair. The office was dim, the only light the orange glow of the stove. He let the words sink like stones into water. The press, the chamber, the public, they were all currents tugging at the same impossible story. His task was not merely to follow facts, but to hold steady against the tide until the current turned. Yet he could not help but feel the weight of it pressing closer. For every day the impossibility remained unsolved, the more it ceased to be a case and became a symbol of police incompetence, of judicial weakness, of society's hunger for marvels, and symbols were always harder to dismantle than cases. Late that night, long after the clerks had gone and the city slept under its fog, Maigret remained at his desk. The reports lay before him, the testimony of the victim, the words of the night watchman, the confession of Madame Fournier, the rumours of cousins and doubles. He thought of d'Archamp, silent in his cell, his faint smile as though he were the only man not perturbed by the storm his name had raised. The newspapers would print again in the morning, thicker, louder, hungrier. Politicians would whisper of scandal, judges of reputation, citizens of impossibility. But Maigret, tamping the ash of his pipe, thought only of the cot, the barred window, the scratches on the floor. Somewhere among them lay the truth. And the truth, though slower than rumour, though less flamboyant than headlines, had the weight of stone. Outside, the Seine moved silently, carrying its mist through the sleeping city. And Maigret, leaning back in his armchair, let the smoke curl toward the ceiling as he prepared himself for what was to come, the moment when speculation would collide with fact, and when the shadow cast by Paul d'Archamp would have to be measured not in headlines, but in human terms. The summons came on a pale morning, when Paris lay under a ceiling of low clouds, heavy as lead. Maigret had barely lit his first pipe of the day when the note was placed on his desk. The examining magistrate requested his presence at once. There was no explanation, but the inspector knew what awaited. The case of Paul d'Archamp had ceased to be merely a file in a drawer. It had become a matter that pressed upon the dignity of the courts themselves. The Palais de Justice loomed vast and austere, its Gothic towers swallowed in mist. The corridors smelled of damp stone and ink, echoing with the hushed shuffle of clerks and the hollow tread of lawyers hurrying with papers clutched to their chests. Maigret's heavy step resounded like the beat of a drum among the lighter scurry of feet. He was shown into a tall office where velvet curtains were drawn against the noise of the city, leaving only the muted glow of oil lamps. The magistrate, Monsieur Delavigne, rose from behind his desk. He was a lean man with delicate fingers, the face of one who had spent his life in shadows of parchment rather than in the smoke of taverns. Yet there was something restless in his eyes, a nervous gleam betraying the pressure he bore. He gestured Maigret to a chair, and the inspector lowered himself slowly, pipe clenched in his teeth, his hat laid across his knees. "Inspector," Delavigne began, his voice careful, "this affair grows intolerable. The newspapers write daily as if our courts were playhouses. Deputies in the chamber speak of scandal, and I, charged with examining the matter, find myself no longer inquiring into a crime, but into the very credibility of our institutions. Do you understand?" Maigret nodded once, exhaling a curl of smoke that drifted upward. "I understand." The magistrate tapped his fingers on the desk, then leaned forward. "Tell me plainly, do you believe the man in cell 12 could have committed the assaults in Paris and Angers?" Maigret did not answer at once. He gazed into the lamplight as if it were fog condensed into flame. At last he said, "I believe in men more than in doors and bolts. I believe that men lie, that they see what they want to see, that they fear the impossible so much they invent it. As for Darchand, he is in his cell, and yet his shadow walks the streets. I do not yet know how." Delavigne sighed sharply, the sound of a man caught between law and reality. "You speak of shadows, Inspector, but the court cannot judge shadows. We require facts, not impressions. A man is accused, and yet the evidence of his impossibility is as strong as the evidence of his guilt. What verdict can such a court give?" "The truth, when it arrives," Maigret said simply. The magistrate gave a bitter smile. "Truth is slower than rumour, and rumour is what governs Paris today. The public does not wait for verdicts. It demands them in the morning paper." He rose, pacing before the curtains, his long robes whispering across the floor. "If we declare the accusations false, we are accused of blindness. If we proceed, we are accused of folly. And meanwhile, politicians hint that corruption festers in the prison itself, that guards take bribes, that justice sells itself. It is not only Darchand on trial, it is the law." Maigret remained silent, pipe between his teeth, his gaze following the magistrate's movements with calm patience. He had seen many judges wrestle not with evidence, but with appearances. Courts feared scandal more than they feared error. At length, Delavigne stopped, his hands clasped behind his back. "I ask you, Inspector, as one whose reputation stands apart, what am I to do? If I order Darchand released, the city will howl. If I keep him, we are mocked for guarding a man who commits crimes outside his cell. If I delay, I am accused of cowardice." Maigret leaned forward, his great hands resting on the desk. His voice was steady, low, like water pressing against stone. "You do what judges have always done. You wait. You let me find what others do not see. When the truth comes, it will be simple. Until then, do nothing. The more the public clamours, the more silence is needed." Delavigne stared at him, half in disbelief, half in relief. "You speak as if silence were a weapon." "It is. Louder than rumour, if you hold it long enough." For a moment, the magistrate's lips twitched into a rueful smile. "Perhaps you are right, but silence weighs heavier in velvet chambers than in smoky cafes." He sat again, his shoulders slumping with the fatigue of a man carrying more than papers. "Very well, Inspector, you shall have your time. But I warn you, not too much. The tide of gossip rises faster than the tide of truth." When Maigret left the Palais de Justice, the air outside was no clearer. The Seine lay swollen and grey, barges moving slowly against the current. He paused on the Pont au Change, pipe smoke mingling with the mist, and watched the city below, carriages rattling over cobbles, vendors calling from their stalls, newsboys shouting headlines that sold certainty by the halfpenny. He thought of Delavigne, trapped in velvet silence, and of the papers shouting with ink-stained voices. Between them, the truth lay like a drowned body beneath the water, waiting to surface. That evening, in his office at the Quai des Orfèvres, Lucas entered with the latest bundle of papers. "Patron, they say now the guards themselves are accomplices, that Darchand leaves with their help, returns before dawn, and that money passes from hand to hand." Maigret grunted, tapping ash into the tray. "They say many things." "And the ministry?" "They will say nothing, for now." Lucas frowned, uneasy. "If the case falters, they will make a scapegoat. You know it as well as I." Maigret's eyes, half closed behind a veil of smoke, showed no concern. "Then let them. I'm not afraid of being scapegoated. I'm afraid of being wrong." When Lucas left, the inspector sat alone in the dim room, the stove ticking, the fog pressing against the window. He thought of Darchand, of the night watchman, of Madame Fournier and her trembling hands. He thought of certainty, that dangerous thing men carried like a lantern, blinding themselves with its glow. and he thought of the judge wrestling not with crime, but with the shadows it cast upon law. The city outside hummed with voices, but in his office Maigret embraced the silence, holding it like a shield. For he knew the truth moved slowly, heavily like the river, and one day soon it would surface. The days grew shorter, and Paris sank into the kind of damp cold that crept under coats and lingered in the bones. Maigret spent long hours at his desk, pipe in hand, staring at files whose paper edges had yellowed with time. He was not looking for fresh testimony or new rumors. Those arrived daily, too many, each contradicting the last. What he sought now was buried in ink already faded, in records that smelled of dust and mildew, in archives where the past waited like a patient conspirator. Darchan's present defied logic. Perhaps his past would explain it. Janvier had carried the boxes up from the archives, his sleeves greyed with dust, his eyes watering from the stale air below. "It's all here, patron," he said, laying them on the desk. The bank in Tours, the fraud, the early suspicions before he was caught, old correspondence, reports from provincial police, some of it hardly legible anymore. Maigret only nodded, settling heavily into his armchair. He spread the first file open and drew the lamp closer. The letters curled, the ink blotched, but slowly, patiently, he pieced together a life that had led to the iron cot of cell 12. Paul Darchan had been born in a small town not far from Orléans, the son of a station master and a woman whose family ran a tobacco shop. The report spoke of a childhood neither poor nor privileged, marked by nothing more unusual than good marks at school and a fondness for solitary walks along the river banks. Yet even in those early notes, written by teachers and local officials, Maigret sensed a tone. Reserved, self-contained, observant. Words that hinted at a boy who had watched more than he spoke. Later came the bank job in Tours. The files grew thicker, more detailed. Darchan had been efficient, trusted, the kind of clerk whose handwriting was admired for its precision. But precision, Maigret knew, could hide deceit as easily as it served honesty. Soon there were whispers of irregularities, amounts that did not tally, sums that moved through ledgers like fish darting in dark water. When the fraud was uncovered, Darchan had already left town, slipping away before the warrants arrived. His capture months later was almost anticlimactic, a clerk hiding in a cheap lodging, betrayed by the landlady's suspicion of his late hours and lack of visitors. Maigret leaned back, puffing his pipe, watching the smoke coil toward the ceiling. Fraud, escape, capture, nothing unusual in itself. Yet the reports contained odd notes. A policeman in Tours had remarked, "The man does not seem concerned by his arrest. He smiles as though we have joined a game he has been playing alone." Another report from Orléans long before mentioned a cousin who resembled him, a boy named Henri who vanished from records as soon as he appeared. The cousin again? The shadow self that Madame Fournier had mentioned in her café? Maigret sifted carefully, searching for scraps. A baptismal record with 2 names, one crossed out. A school registry with a blank line where another pupil's name had once been. No proof, nothing solid, yet the suggestion ran like a hidden thread through the papers. 2 boys, perhaps, or one boy who enjoyed the illusion of being 2. As the lamp burned low, Maigret imagined Darchan as a young man walking through provincial streets, moving silently in and out of ledgers, creating holes in records that men would puzzle over years later. Always quiet, always smiling faintly, as if he carried another existence just out of sight. Perhaps it was no trick of cells and bolts at all, but a trick of identity. One life sitting on a cot, another walking the streets. The following morning, Maigret took the train south again, not to Tours this time, but to Orléans. The provincial station smelled of coal smoke and wet wool, and the town itself was subdued under grey skies. He walked its narrow streets, pipe smoke trailing, and asked questions in cafes where old men lingered. They remembered Darshand vaguely, the quiet boy of the station-master, the one who left for the bank. Some spoke of another, a cousin or a brother, always uncertain, always contradicting themselves. The cousin, it seemed, had appeared only when needed, as an excuse, a rumour, a story. At the town hall he pored over records again. The clerks brought faded books, their pages brittle. There it was once more, the baptism of Paul Darshand, a neat entry in Latin. And on the facing page a second entry begun but never finished, the ink blotched, the name illegible. Someone had started to record another child, then stopped. That evening, Maigret returned to Paris with the smell of provincial damp still in his coat. He sat in his office long after dark, the stove glowing faintly, and thought of what he had seen. It was not proof, it was suggestion, whispers in ink, shadows in the past. Yet it gave shape to the impossible, the idea that Paul Darshand had always been two, whether in fact or in story. Lucas entered quietly, setting down a fresh bundle of newspapers. "They're louder each day, patron. Now they say the police protect a gang of doubles, that men slip in and out of prisons at will." Maigret grunted, tamping his pipe. "Let them." "But the ministry waits like judges wait, with less patience, but more velvet." Lucas smiled faintly, recognizing the inspector's mood, and left him alone. Maigret leaned back in his chair, the pipe glowing red. The case had grown larger than Cell 12, larger than Darshand himself. It had become a question of how a man's past could echo so strongly in his present, how shadows from childhood could spread across the walls of a prison. Somewhere in those faded records lay the answer, not only to whether Darshand left his cell, but to how men carried illusions so deeply within them that others swore to their truth. The night deepened. The Seine moved darkly outside, carrying the reflections of lamps and bridges. In his office, Maigret let the silence settle, his thoughts heavy, his eyes half closed. He felt closer now, not to the trick, but to the man. And he knew that to solve the impossibility of the present, he would have to untangle the knots of the past, thread by patient thread. The rain began before dawn, steady, relentless, turning the cobbles of Paris into black mirrors that reflected blurred lamps and the shifting feet of early passers-by. By the time Maigret arrived at the Quai des Orfèvres, his overcoat was heavy with damp, and his bowler shone with beads of water. He moved slowly through the courtyard, pipe clenched between his teeth, his shoulders stooped not with fatigue, but with the weight of an answer that had taken shape at last. For days he had sifted whispers, testimonies, rumours and records until they no longer contradicted but converged. Not in the neat manner of a conjurer's trick, but in the heavy, inevitable way of human lives entangled. Paul Darshand had not left his cell, that much was true. Yet Paul Darshand had also been seen on the streets of Paris, in Angers, in Tours. That too was true in the sense that truth often lies not in facts, but in convictions. The impossibility had dissolved when Maigret accepted what he had resisted all along. Darshand was two men, not in myth, not in rumour, but in flesh. The cousin, the double, the shadow self, hinted at in every faded record, he existed. Henri Darshand, born the same year, raised for a time under the same roof, then vanishing into the margins of registers. While Paul built a life of ledgers and fraud, Henri drifted, half forgotten, reappearing only when needed, always under another guise. When Paul was arrested, Henri became his shadow, carrying his face into streets and provinces, letting witnesses swear to what they had seen. The locked cell had never been breached, the walls had never lied. What had lied was the certainty of those who believed one face meant one man. That morning, the final piece had arrived. A constable in Orléans had unearthed an old complaint filed against Henri. Petty theft, swiftly dropped, when the complainant swore he must have mistaken the culprit for the bank clerk Paul. Again the confusion of identities, again the shadow playing at truth. It was the same pattern, repeated until it became a net that trapped even the police. When Maigret entered cell 12, Paul d'Archamps looked up from his cot with that same faint, unreadable smile. The inspector filled the space with his bulk pipe glowing, rainwater still clinging to his sleeves. "You knew it would come to this," Maigret said quietly. d'Archamps tilted his head. "What do you mean?" "That you are too. That while you sit here, another walks. Not a phantom, not an escape. A man."
"Your cousin, your brother, whatever word suits you. Henri." For a moment, the prisoner's expression did not change. Then slowly, his smile deepened, not in mockery, not in triumph, but in the weary relief of a secret acknowledged. "And if I told you Henri has been dead these 10 years? If I told you he never existed except in my imagination? What then, Inspector?" Maigret stepped closer, his shadow falling across the cot. "Then you would still have explained everything, without explaining anything. The world does not need Henri to exist. It needs only to believe it has seen him." Paul lowered his gaze to his hands, clasped loosely in his lap. "Men will always choose the story over the truth, and sometimes the story becomes the truth." Maigret studied him a long while, then turned and rapped on the door. The bolts shrieked, the lock clicked, and he stepped out into the corridor. He had no need of confession, he had enough. The rest would unfold as it always did, slowly, heavily, like rain running through gutters into the Seine. By evening, the newspapers had shifted their tune. Some spoke of a mysterious cousin, others of a twin long hidden, still others of police brilliance in unmasking a conspiracy. None of them were correct, yet none were entirely wrong. The truth was there, half buried, distorted by ink and urgency. But Maigret no longer cared. He knew what had happened, and he knew it mattered less than what men believed had happened. That night, rain lashed the windows of his office. The stove glowed faintly, casting a dull warmth against the damp. Maigret sat alone, pipe smoke curling upward, his thoughts heavy but calm. He thought of Henri, whether real or imagined, whether living or dead. He thought of Paul, smiling faintly in his locked cell, content to let the world argue over impossibilities. He thought of the witnesses so certain, and of the watchman so cautious in his doubt. He thought of the magistrate trapped between velvet silence and public clamour, and of the woman in the cafe trembling as she spoke of shadows in a man she once loved. Outside, the Seine swelled under the rain, carrying away the reflections of lamps and bridges. The city buzzed with talk of doubles, of tricks, of scandal. But for Maigret, the case had ended, not with triumph, not with revelation, but with the heavy acceptance that men are never as simple as the locks that confine them. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and let the smoke drift upward. The rain tapped steadily at the glass, and in its rhythm he heard the final note of the mystery. The truth, when it comes, is rarely clean. It is muddied with rumour, blurred with memory, and carried off by the river before anyone can fix it in place. And in that muddiness life continued. Prisoners turned on their cots, judges tapped their fingers on desks, journalists sharpened their headlines. Paris, indifferent, rolled on under its rain, its fog, its endless appetite for stories. Maigret
opened his eyes, puffed once more at his pipe, and watched the smoke curl like a question mark before it faded into nothing.